So, funny thing about the internet, you never know when you're about to kick a hornet's nest, am I right? This has just been one of those weeks when I have been absolutely inundated with comments and reaction videos, people divided into camps, throwing arguments at each other over something I said, on a topic that I literally and somewhat ironically thought was a throwaway video. Surrogacy. In a recent question and answer video, I briefly responded to a question about surrogacy as an alternative to pregnancy, shared how it was against church teaching for such and such a reason, and moved on to the next question. I thought it would be a good reminder to people, so I cut it up for a short and posted it on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, but frankly, I didn't think it would get much traction. I mean, call me naive, but who thought this was such a hot button and completely misunderstood issue? People are really angry about it. And really misinformed. Originally, I hadn't planned on doing much more with this topic, but given the interest, given the misinformation, given the outright frustration, it would seem foolish to pass up this opportunity. And so I want to jump on here very quickly to address all the issues I can with one video, hopefully giving some clarity to a lot of the misunderstanding out there. Let's start with a recap of what I said, and I'll expand on that. Is there any moral justification for surrogacy? No. This is literally never justified. I understand that some will see it as a good, that it allows families to have children who otherwise would never have been able to do so, but it really is one of the more unnatural aspects of our culture. Not only does it separate procreation from the sexual act, making it invalid, it includes a third party into the union, a grave offense, and treats that third party as nothing more than a body, a carrier. This is highly problematic. So that's what we're working with. That's what I said. My quick comment on church teaching that I thought no one would really care about. Boy, was I wrong. The first things that popped up immediately and has persisted all week is just a poor understanding of the Bible. Let's start with what people got wrong about Mary.
Was the Virgin Mary was a surrogate? Was she not? I don't have a super cool tunic like you, and I am by no means a biblical scholar, but I sure do know what the definition of that word is. And I'm pretty sure that she fits that definition. So when you say literally never acceptable, I feel like you might need to run this dance by the big guy upstairs, because something tells me he might not agree with your take here, Casey.
Yeah, so that's not surrogacy. I think that's pretty clear, right? Surrogacy is taking an egg from a woman, fertilizing it with the sperm of a man, and then placing it within the uterus of another woman, making the child not genetically related to the woman carrying the child to term, and making her into nothing more than a body to be used. This doesn't apply to Mary. Mary wasn't a third party. She wasn't a body to be used as nothing more than an incubator to bring the child to term. She was the mother of Jesus. This is pretty basic Christian theology. Jesus was fully God, but also fully man. The reason that Matthew and Luke have genealogies is to emphasize Jesus' human origin as well, that he shared in the flesh of Mary. She wasn't a surrogate, she was a mother.
I don't think that Mary was a surrogate, but she was a virgin. It was the Virgin Mary, and yet she had a baby. But you say that procreation without the actual sexual act is invalid. Then how do you explain the Virgin Mary? Like, hello, do you hear yourself?
I said that separating a sexual act from procreation is immoral, meaning that there is a sexual act somewhere, it's just removed from the act of procreation. This is not my opinion, this is just basic boilerplate Catholic moral theology when it comes to sexual activity. The church teaches that there are two natural ends to sex, procreation and the unity between the couple, and that both have to be willed for a sexual act to be moral. They don't necessarily have to be achieved. Obviously, it won't happen in every single case, but they have to be willed or at least have an openness to those two. Any act that actively wills something different or avoids one of these two is immoral. It's a point that doesn't apply to the Virgin Mary because pretty obviously she was a virgin, and so there was never actually a sexual act. The procreation came in a non-sexual way. The Holy Spirit conceived Jesus inside of her by means of a miracle. Which, if you're not a Christian and don't want to take that intellectual leap, fine, but that's not the point. The point is that in doing so, this did not make her a surrogate, and it did not violate any ethical teaching on sex because there was no sex to violate. The issue is not procreation without sex, it's sex without procreation, and since there's no sex, there was no violation.
Mary was a child whom your God chose, without her consent, to reproduce with.
Now, I realize that we're getting a bit away from the issue of surrogacy per se, but there was so much that was churned up by this video that I feel like I need to address it all. It is correct that Mary was young to have a child compared to today's standards, but to call her a child is socially, historically, and biologically not correct. Mary was capable of having a child herself. She was past the age of puberty, meaning that while she may not have been a middle-aged woman, she was not a child either. Now listen, if you want to debate about the age of consent, what's right, what's wrong, fine, be my guest, I ain't going anywhere near that. The fact of the matter is that the age of consent for marriage and sexual activity in the ancient Near Eastern culture in which Mary lived was much younger than ours today, and so in her time, no one would have seen Mary having a child as an abuse in the slightest. This was just the norm. And as for doing this without her consent, which came up dozens of times, we can literally read it in the Bible. Mary said, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, may it be done to me according to your word." She gave her consent. So, yeah, a lot of misconceptions about Mary. But unfortunately, she was not the only one catching strays in my comments this week, as everyone seemed to want to talk about Hagar all of a sudden, the maidservant of Sarah and the concubine of Abraham. As you're probably familiar, Sarah could not conceive of a child and so offered Hagar in her place. "The Lord has kept me from bearing children. Have intercourse with my maid. Perhaps I will have sons through her," leading many people to ask the question, what about Hagar? To which I ask, what about Hagar? This question was asked dozens of times on all three platforms, and I really want to know what people are thinking it means that Sarah had a child through Hagar. This is not the modern, biological sense of surrogacy that we're debating. At best, it's a familial, social claiming of a child, basically an adoption. It was Hagar that had sex with Abraham, Hagar that conceived the child with her own egg, and Hagar that gave birth to the child. In no way is Sarah involved in the making of this child. Hagar is not an example of surrogacy. She's an example of adultery and abuse. Abraham used her for a child with no desire to care for her, and here's the kicker, God was not happy with the situation. Just because it happened in the Bible doesn't mean that it's good. So yeah, the Bible was used in some weird ways this week, and I felt like we needed to address this, but it wasn't just the rough biblical arguments that were being thrown around. There was a lot of confusion on the larger concept of Catholic morality as it relates to biology. For instance, one person wrote, "Much of modern medicine is not natural. Yet we embrace medicine, pacemakers, oxygen tanks, radiation, and chemotherapy. We do these things to stay alive. Life is valuable. So I don't know why surrogacy isn't welcome." A lot of people had this question in one way or another. The idea of natural seemed to be a sticking point, feeling like Catholic moral theology just picks and chooses which artificial things are okay and which ones are not. Obviously, this is not correct. The point we want to make here is that the introduction of artificial means is not necessarily a bad thing. When it aids and assists in the natural function of human life as created by God and allows the person to do what they normally would not be able to do, this is a good thing. Pacemakers, oxygen tanks, medicine, these are all good things because they assist the body in doing what it is already doing. This is why surrogacy as we have it now is wrong, but why, interesting enough, this person's comment is not necessarily correct. Wait until they invent artificial wombs. You Catholics are going to get upset. Maybe, but maybe not. It really depends on how it works. On the one hand, absolutely. You can see how this could create some ethical nightmares. You can imagine a baby farm in which fertilized eggs are placed inside artificial wombs and the entire process of creating life is removed from human activity. We are not a fan of the dystopian world akin to the Matrix. But on the other hand, depending on how it worked, an artificial womb might actually be allowed by the church, as it could serve, in some cases, as just a more developed incubator. If it were not actually a human uterus being exploited, but just some mechanism that nurtured an embryo until it reached the point of viability, that would be a wonderful bit of technology that could save many lives. One issue related to this that came up a lot was organ donation. Some, seeing the transfer of human flesh from one person to another, saw a parallel between organ donation and surrogacy, but I think it's pretty clearly different. In surrogacy, a woman holds onto and nurtures something that does not belong to her, at great risk to herself, before turning it back over to someone else. She is used for her body with no benefit to her body at all. In organ transplantation, however, the organ becomes a part of the recipient, helping them to survive. There are some ethical debates about organ donation among Catholics, but by and large, it is a completely different situation and completely allowed. But let's move more to the social side of things, as a lot of people thought that it was simply a matter of free choice. If a woman wanted to offer this as a service to another, why couldn't she make this sacrifice?
I'm willing to carry your baby so that you and your partner can have a family. I'm willing to sacrifice my own body, my own life for the next 9 months so that you guys can have a family. I think that Jesus would be like, oh my God, yes. Why would Jesus not want that? It is literally one of the ultimate sacrifices that a woman can do. She is literally giving up her entire body.
And I totally hear that. As Jesus himself says, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for a friend. In no way do I want to judge the motivation of some women who do this out of the purity of their heart, giving up everything for someone else. The motivation they have is truly beautiful, but I just cannot agree that Jesus would be pleased with someone doing something so immoral. I cannot see him being thrilled that they were intervening in the procreation of human life, manipulating and conjuring it up in a lab, separating the sexual act from procreation. What this does, and what's behind so many of these issues, is a feeling of entitlement for a baby at all costs, that people believe that they deserve one and can do anything they want to get one. I don't think that that's a road we want to go down, the ends justifying the means. I just don't like someone putting themselves through pain and suffering for another so that they can manipulate God's creation and play God themselves. This may be well-intentioned, but it is not a great result. The analogy that I think is quite apt, and what I've been using to respond to questions like this in the comments, is that of indentured servitude. Here we have a situation in history in which people willingly gave up their rights, signed contracts to become servants or slaves for a period of time. They actively chose it. It was their free will. But that didn't make the situation right or good for them. Yes, it's true they may have freely signed up for it, but what they got was the stripping of their human dignity. And let's be frank here. Even though they may have freely signed up for it, it's clear that only desperate women ever did volunteer. When it is only the poor and hopeless that are choosing an option, do you really think that they are completely free? I highly doubt it. This same issue is being played out with surrogacy today. I have no doubt that there are some women out there selflessly sacrificing their bodies for the love of another person, sure. But it's just not the norm. What we are seeing around the world is the abuse and commodification of women for their bodies, allowing rich people to use the wombs of people who are potentially desperate for money or forced into the situation by coercion. This is a growing problem, which is why surrogacy is being banned in many places. And yes, I believe I can say this, even as a man who never plans to procreate, because you can have a moral stance on something that doesn't even affect you directly. I don't plan on getting murdered, but I still think that it's wrong. I am not black, but I still stand against racism. I do not live in Mexico, but I can certainly act for the well-being of all its people. This is what the church does and why it will always have something to say. It is not a matter of having dogma for dogma's sake. It's not about trying to be controlling. It's about the protection of human dignity for all. The dignity of the child that is being manipulated into existence. The dignity of the parents who just want a child. The dignity of the woman who is being used by others. We must defend them all. Now, unfortunately, there were thousands of comments and I couldn't get to every single issue, but hopefully this was helpful for you and at least gives a framework for understanding Catholic moral theology. If you're interested in learning more about the doctrine around this issue, I recommend checking out the USCCB's website, which has a ton of great materials.